Greetings. I'm going to be posting updates to this same topic here periodically because we can never forget what's happening here. In 2001, in New York City, 9/11, 2,996 Americans were killed by Islamic extremists, terrorists as we called them back then. And no American's ever going to forget this. And I remember it well because I was working in New York City at the time. I was working in New York for almost the entire year of 2001, all the way through the end of December. I remember flying into town every week and flying down to Hudson and then turning around and going back up to Hudson and seeing the smoke come out of southern Manhattan. It had a certain smell that you could smell up in the air. And now we have 50,000 Americans who are dead and counting, 50,000 and counting, due to China, first of all, and also due to the incompetence of the CDC. So China, is at fault for this. It's, something the Chinese Communist Party tried to cover up. Having a virus, and they first blamed it on this wet market, seafood market, where they butcher live animals and butcher fish in front of you, and that's always a good way to, good opportunity to get a viral infection because, during the butchering process, there's blood splatter and people working there. But the issue is with this seafood market, it didn't sell bats, and this virus is definitely from a bat, and the species has been identified, what species it's closest to, and the wet market wouldn't have access to these bats. They were located, on islands off of the East China coast. And then we have the CDC. The incompetence of the CDC is something that we should always remember. Not just China, the CDC, our own organization, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. How are they controlling this? They have absolutely no control or no clue. So these are previous coronavirus pandemics. SARS, you see on the left, there's a chart and a table. This is from Wikipedia, and MERS on the right. So these are two of the biggest pandemics for coronaviruses. And on the left you have China with 5,300 cases, 349 deaths, almost 300 deaths in Hong Kong, and it also infected Taiwan, Canada, Singapore, Vietnam. It went as far south as Malaysia, and it's about the furthest south I see here, Indonesia. And on the right we have MERS, which is the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, and that broke out in Saudi Arabia. Somehow South Korea got in there, and the rest of it's basically Middle Eastern countries. And that resulted in 1,030 deaths in Saudi Arabia. But you can see the effect on the SARS and MERS epidemics in the United States here. And in SARS on the left, I enlarged this a little bit so it's easier to read. There were 27 cases, no deaths. And on the right, MERS, there were 2 cases and no deaths. So you can say that the CDC was prepared for something like this. 27 cases from SARS and 2 cases from MERS. They were prepared because they had a few test kits. But there was never a CDC plan for a viral pandemic. And here you can see the Johns Hopkins dashboard here, which is famous. Everybody in the world uses this. If you keep up on world news, I look at the news coming out of European countries and Germany and Spain and France and and Italy also. And you can see that they use this Johns Hopkins tracker here. and this was created by the Center for Systems Science and Engineering, which is a research institute at Johns Hopkins University. And like I said, the entire world uses this dashboard here. So what is the purpose of the CDC? Their purpose, you can go up on their site. I have their purpose and their, a lot of information on the CDC in another video where this video also needs to be updated. I'll work on it right now. It's in 2 half-hour videos. I'm going to try to put them both together and keep it at a half an hour. But their purpose is to protect this country from disease and viral outbreaks. But there was never a CDC plan for a pandemic, which is shocking. Which we can blame this on China. Of course, it's China's fault, but the CDC didn't exactly help out here. They're not exactly leaders. They're not world leaders. They're not leaders of any type. They're not even good followers. So one thing you need to have with the CDC that we know now is the ability to adapt, the ability to watch other countries, to see what China did right and what China did wrong and what Korea did right. Korea didn't do anything wrong. Korea invented new ways of fighting this virus, and they went from the first country to break, to 2,000 cases, 3,000, all the way up to 7,000 cases. They were the first. It looked like everybody in Korea was going to die at one time there, the way they were increasing every day. And then it flatlined. They never got past 10,000 cases, or they're past 10,000, but not by much. They basically leveled out at 10,000 cases. So our CDC doesn't have that ability to see what's going on and to adapt, to see what China did wrong. China, one thing they did wrong that, was, well, first they allowed 5 million people out of 11 million in Wuhan out of the city and, into the rest of the world. They banned flights from Wuhan to other cities in China, but, they let them escape to the rest of the world. Adequate policies and procedures to produce or acquire an adequate volume of test kits and testing components. I don't know what made these people think that their 1,000 test cases would be enough. It's enough for 27 cases. It's not enough for, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. So you hear, but there's not only an inadequate volume of cases, but, the testing components. You hear about, for test kits, you hear things like a lack of swabs, and in testing components, a lack of chemicals. This shouldn't happen. We shouldn't have a lack of anything, because the CDC ought to mandate, adequate levels of, kits and components and chemicals. Adequate joint plan with the DOS, DHS, TSA, ICE, National Guard, local and state police. And, I put all these organizations in here because, each one of them has, a responsibility. The Department of State is responsible for keeping, foreign nationals like Chinese from boarding planes to the United States. We have, Department of State people in China, and they should be stopping people from, pandemic areas from boarding planes to go to the United States. And they can be sneaky. Look at the Chinese woman who boarded she had tested positive for coronavirus, and she had a fever. And she took some drugs to bring her fever down, and she went to the airport and got past screening and flew to Paris and, had dinner with her friends and shot a video having dinner with her friends in Paris and bragging about how she has coronavirus, and she's now in Paris having dinner with her friends. Department of Homeland Security, once you get over to the United States, the Department of Homeland Security should take over. Transportation Safety Administration, which comes under the DHS, and that'll they have responsibilities at airports, but have they ever trained for incoming pandemics at airports? I doubt it. I seriously doubt it. ICE, the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, these are the people in the DHS that carry guns and badges. They're the people that can make arrests. So you need those, and you need ICE involved too. Even though their primary responsibility is illegal immigration, illegal entry to the United States after the president bans people from your country or your area is, also should be under their responsibility. National Guard basically for numbers, if there's not enough, TSA people at an airport or not enough DHS people in a geographic area, bring in the National Guard to help. We should learn that from China. China brought in the army. Local or state police, and that would come into effect when you have a small town America population 50,000 people, and it's not enough to warrant sending the National Guard in. You have to depend on local and state police departments to watch out for people who are from another country, from a hotspot area. So this would involve people from incoming flights and other ways of entering the country, and passengers coming in from ships, cruise ships and stuff like that. It involves everything, but it involves these agencies. Adequate inventory of personal protection equipment. Now, this isn't, this is also the fault of American companies. I don't know why so many American companies are still hell-bent on manufacturing in China. China is not a good place. I mean, I've worked in the medical field, but I'm more of an expert on Chinese intellectual property theft and illegal business practices. So we have companies like 3M and DuPont who are manufacturing things like Tyvek suits and respirator masks in China. And what happens when there's a big pandemic in China? Well, China confiscates the inventory and sends it to Wuhan, and we don't have any inventory of 3M and DuPont equipment, Tyvek suits. We're out of stuff like this. But you can blame that on illegal business practices and something that China will always be famous for. But you can also blame it on the CDC. Why doesn't the CDC mandate inventory levels of personal protection equipment? Like, foresee a pandemic and mandate a 1-year inventory of personal protection equipment. We wouldn't be in the kind of condition that we're in right now if there were adequate numbers of personal protection equipment. Adequate inventory of ventilators and other medical equipment. Again, mandate an inventory of this kind of stuff. You're the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. How do you control things without mandating things to hospitals? That's craziness. Adequate plan to mobilize medical professionals. Just recently you're, reading about, other hospitals and other areas in my immediate area, the Cleveland Clinic, one of the premier hospitals in the world famous hospital, sent people to New York City, and in the last few days or within the last week, they sent 500 medical professionals to Michigan, to the Detroit area. So this is something that you can plan ahead of time. There's other areas of the country that can follow the lead of China here. China made the news. Well, they made the news because I read Chinese news. I don't know how much press this got, but about 3 or 4 weeks ago now, there were films of nurses getting on airplanes and leaving Wuhan, because Wuhan was the epicenter in Hubei province, the big city in Hubei province. That was the epicenter where all this stuff started happening. And they sent in medical professionals from other cities around China. And I think the first city to leave was Tianjin. And then you saw Shanghai, medical professionals getting on, getting first in buses to go to the airport and then go back to Shanghai, because they're done working in Wuhan. We could have had some kind of plan like that. But no, we didn't. So we should never forget what China did to us. We should never forget what the CDC allowed to happen here in the United States. We should take a look at this global tracker by Johns Hopkins. I actually worked at Johns Hopkins, but I didn't work at the research institute that's putting this global tracker together. But look at this map of the United States. It's all red. It's all full of viruses. This is a pandemic. What the Center for Disease Control is supposed to protect us from a pandemic. You can't, China is always going to, have the virus du jour here. They're always going to have a virus. There's been a lot of them. There's, swine flu, bird flu, coronaviruses. It's always going to happen in China. But the CDC is what is supposed to protect us in the United States, and they just didn't do it. They didn't do their job.